The shifting path. Our next chilling account comes from a seasoned trail runner and former park ranger, a woman we'll call Evelyn. She shared her ordeal on a wilderness survival forum, a place where people trade tips and cautionary tales. Evelyn was a true expert in the outdoors, familiar with every twist and turn of the trails in her region, and she prided herself on her innate sense of direction and her unflappable composure in the wild. She possessed an almost intuitive connection to the land, a sixth sense for its nuances that few others could claim. This particular incident happened to Evelyn during an early morning run on a trail she knew intimately, the Whispering Pines Loop, a roughly 15-mile circuit through a dense, old-growth forest near her home in the Pacific Northwest. She had run this loop hundreds of times, in all seasons, in all conditions. She could have navigated it blindfolded, relying on the subtle changes in elevation, the specific scent of certain tree clusters, or the unique feel of the earth beneath her feet. It was a clear, crisp autumn morning. The sun was just beginning to filter through the tall pines, casting dappled light on the forest floor. The air was cool and invigorating, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Evelyn was enjoying the rhythmic pounding of her feet on the packed dirt, the quiet solitude of the early hours. Everything felt normal, peaceful, predictable. She had covered about 7 miles, nearing a distinctive section of the trail that wound through a particularly ancient grove of cedars. There was a large, oddly shaped boulder, split down the middle, that served as an unofficial landmark. She'd always used it to gauge her progress, a silent sentinel marking the halfway point. As she approached the spot where the boulder should have been, she noticed something was off. The trees here seemed denser, darker, their shadows deeper and more oppressive. The path felt narrower, less defined, the familiar packed dirt giving way to looser soil and more roots. And the split boulder? It wasn't there. Evelyn stopped, a frown creasing her brow, a cold knot forming in her stomach. This was impossible. She backtracked a few yards, scanning the tree line with a growing sense of unease, searching frantically for the familiar landmark. Nothing. She checked her GPS watch. It showed her precisely on the trail, right where the boulder should have been. A green dot confidently asserting her position. Yet the landscape before her was entirely alien. It felt like she had suddenly been transported to a different section of the forest, one she didn't recognize at all, despite her encyclopedic knowledge of the area. She decided it must be a momentary lapse. Perhaps she'd taken a wrong turn, though she couldn't fathom how, given the clear path. She pulled out her physical map, unfolded it with trembling hands, and tried to orient herself. The map clearly showed the trail continuing, yet the visual cues around her simply didn't match. The undergrowth was too thick, a thorny, tangled mess that seemed to rise higher than it should. The trees were too tightly packed, their trunks too uniform, lacking the distinct characteristics she knew. She tried to follow what she thought was the trail, but it quickly became overgrown, disappearing into a wall of thorny bushes and impenetrable thickets, a path that simply should not exist on this well-maintained loop. A prickle of profound unease began to creep up her spine, quickly escalating into a cold dread. This wasn't just a wrong turn. This was wrong. The forest here felt different. The light seemed to dim, even though the sun was now higher in the sky, as if the canopy had suddenly grown thicker, obscuring the sky. The familiar sounds of the woods, the distant calls of jays, the rustle of squirrels, the gentle hum of insects, were absent. It was the same unnatural silence she had heard in other accounts of wilderness disappearances, a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed in on her ears, making her own heartbeat sound unnaturally loud. She decided to retrace her steps further, to find a section she recognized, a point of reference to anchor her sanity. She walked back along the path she had just come, her pace quickening, a rising sense of panic beginning to bubble in her chest. She reached what should have been a gentle downhill slope, a long, gradual descent she always enjoyed, and found a steep uphill climb. And a different set of trees, towering and unfamiliar, and no signs of her own footprints on the soft earth, as if the ground itself had reset behind her. Evelyn stopped again, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her mind raced, frantically trying to reconcile what her eyes were seeing with what her brain knew to be true. The trail had changed. The landscape around her was morphing, shifting, subtly but undeniably. It was like she was in a dream, where the geography of a familiar place constantly rearranges itself, defying logic and memory, twisting into an impossible labyrinth. She tried to stay calm, to think rationally, to apply her decades of wilderness training. She pulled out her compass. It spun wildly, a frantic, meaningless dance, then settled, but pointed in a direction that made no sense. North was no longer north. The sun, which had been rising in the east, now seemed to be in a slightly different position, casting shadows that felt alien, elongated, and distorted. Her GPS watch, which had previously shown her on the trail, now displayed a flickering, erratic signal, placing her in a blank, unmapped void, a digital ghost in a world that no longer made sense. A wave of profound disorientation washed over her, a physical sensation of vertigo so intense it made her stumble. The trees around her seemed to lean in, their gnarled branches twisting into grotesque shapes, like skeletal fingers reaching for her. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure, making it hard to breathe. She felt an overwhelming sense of being trapped, as if the forest itself was a living entity, actively trying to confuse and ensnare her, playing a cruel, silent game. She tried to call for help on her satellite phone, a crucial piece of safety gear, but there was no signal, just a flat, dead line. She was utterly alone, deep within a forest that refused to obey the laws of physics or her memory. She walked, then ran, then walked again, trying every direction, desperate to find anything familiar, any sign of the world she knew. But every path she took led to more of the same: unfamiliar trees, impossible inclines, and the ever-present, suffocating silence. The forest felt like a labyrinth, its walls constantly reforming, mocking her desperate attempts to escape. Hours passed. What should have been a 2-hour run stretched into an eternity. Her water supply dwindled to a few desperate sips. Exhaustion began to set in, a bone-deep weariness. But the raw, primal fear kept her moving, a desperate, adrenaline-fueled energy. She heard strange sounds now, distant, guttural growls that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. the sharp snap of branches that sounded far too close, and occasionally a low, mocking whisper that seemed to echo her own name, a sibilant hiss that slithered through the trees. She started to shout, her voice hoarse and raw, but it was swallowed by the oppressive silence, dying before it reached even a few feet, as if the forest itself absorbed her pleas. Finally, as dusk began to fall, painting the sky in bruised purples and ominous oranges, a sky that seemed to mock her ordeal, she saw it, a glint of metal through the trees. It was her car, her truck, exactly where she'd parked it that morning, pristine and untouched, as if the day's nightmare had never happened. She stumbled out of the woods, collapsing onto the gravel road, sobbing with relief, her body trembling uncontrollably, her muscles screaming in protest. She looked back at the tree line from which she had emerged. It looked perfectly normal. The entrance to the Whispering Pines Loop, familiar and innocuous, stretched before her. The trees were the right kind, the path wide and clear. There were no impenetrable thickets, no impossible inclines, nothing to suggest the surreal nightmare she had just endured. It was as if the forest had simply decided to release her, to drop its illusion, leaving her to question her own sanity. Evelyn drove straight home, her mind reeling, her body aching, but her spirit utterly broken. She checked her GPS track from the day. It showed a perfectly normal, straight line into the loop, then a sudden, jagged, incomprehensible mess of lines and dots, spiraling wildly in every direction, defying all logic, before suddenly returning to the starting point. The duration of her run was over 10 hours, a lifetime compressed into a single, terrifying day. Evelyn still runs, but never on that trail again. She knows, deep down, that something in those woods actively disoriented her, played with her sense of reality, twisted the very fabric of space and time around her. The forest wasn't just unfamiliar, it was hostile. It changed itself to trap her, to break her. And she often wonders if, just beyond the trees, there's an invisible line, a threshold, where the rules of our world cease to apply, and the ancient, primal forces of the wilderness take over, waiting to toy with the unwary, to show them just how fragile their reality truly is.